is talk mostly about ocean outbreak, because that's the newer one. But I'll also sort of weave in some things about A Sea of Glass at the end, because that still continues to be, for me, a very active book. So I guess we should start with the ocean, right? So that's why I have this slide up here, is to sort of work you into my immersive world. But don't hesitate to ask me questions as I go along here. And so the thing I love about this beautiful picture is, one, that it shows the edge of our Pacific Ocean. Of course, it shows our coastal area, but it also shows where I'm based and where I live, sort of near the tip of Vancouver Island. And what you can't see is it also shows the phytoplankton from space that, of course, are producing half the oxygen that we breathe on this planet. And so, again, it's not very bright here, but these are all the little plankton blooms off the shore of Vancouver Island. And then we're based right here in the San Juan Islands at this beautiful marine lab, Friday Harbor Lab. So for any of you that correspond with me, that's where I am, sort of sitting there, working away, teaching our next generation. So I want to talk about ocean outbreak, and one of the reasons to write this book was actually to review kind of the ways back to a healthy ocean, to also solve some problems, in addition to kind of dialing people in to some of the issues. And I have to tell you, the funny thing is, a lot of times when maybe some of you think this too, when I talk to folks on the street and start talking about infectious diseases in the ocean, they just look totally baffled. I mean, the concept that a coral could get sick, or an abalone could get sick, or a starfish could get sick is surprising to some people. And so I'm like, I guess it was a good thing to write this book. And this is kind of me in the field doing what I do, always with these students, and working and training the next generation, and also just trying to solve the mysteries of these sort of host microbial interactions and what's going on. So this was a really cool place. This is Palmyra Atoll in the middle of the Pacific, and so wrapped into both these books are a lot of my stories about the work that we do, the people I work with, and how we go about solving these kinds of mysteries. And it's not just me that thinks this is important. This is an article that was in the New York Times a couple of years ago, and I really loved it because they kind of nailed it in terms of talking about disease outbreaks as mysteries and mysterious, but also kind of important because they're sentinels of change. And what are they telling us about our changing planet? Of course, these are all things that are going on land, and bats carrying stuff that's transmitted to primates, that's transmitted to humans. But I mean, the same stuff is happening under the water, but we know so much less. So that's our beat. That's what we do. The focus of my group is always to study these hosts, such as the corals, the seagrasses, or the sea stars, interacting with the microbes that are making them sick. But I'm an ecologist, so we're always interested in how a changing climate or changing environment is affecting this. And then the lucky part about my job is I get to work with these phenomenal, super talented people. All of these are students that have worked with us. They've all gone on to professional careers at this point, and so training the future leaders is pretty cool. So I decided to write this book after 5 years of running this Ecology of Infectious Marine Disease project. Come on in. That Peter mentioned was a research coordination network that involved about 50 scientists from around the world leaders that were different kinds of scientists, and that were specialists in all these different groups of organisms that were getting sick, and how they were getting sick, and how these outbreaks were affecting things. And I'm like, this is really too complicated. I don't know how to tell this. We've got all these taxa affected by disease. We have, a really kind of ancient story to tell in the ocean about this battle between infectious organisms and their hosts, disrupted food chains, species endangerment, causes, and then of course scientific innovation in the way back. And so I was kind of baffled about it. And then I don't know if any of you read Michael Pollan's Botany of Desire. And so I was thinking about that and going, that was a cool book, you know. And what he did was he picked 4 plants to tell the whole big story about humans and their interactions with plants. And I thought, oh, well, maybe I could do that. So this is what I did. So I chose coral outbreaks because it's everybody knows our coral reefs are highly endangered by climate change, and a part of that is the infectious disease, a big part of it, and that's kind of the mystery part that's less well known. So I needed that. The starfish outbreak, of course, happened right on our shores, right off the coast here, from San Diego all the way to Alaska, and it is the largest infectious disease outbreak known for wildlife in the ocean, so that was a pretty big deal. The abalone is a story I love, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that when I get there. And then I figured, well, maybe not everybody loves invertebrates, these really cool things the way I do, so I better include something like salmon that people care about. So, and the salmon story is important too. So I'll just tell you a little bit about, just sort of touch on sort of some of these stories in the different groups, and then at the very end I'll come back and just say a little bit, maybe in a more hopeful way, because I don't want you to think everything's dying, and that you know, a lot of these are ongoing stories. It is kind of cool to look at the difference between land and the ocean in terms of the rates of sort of human impact and human industrialization. And so this paper talks about how, you know, 100 years ago human industrialization was really well underway on land, whereas really not much was happening in the ocean. Things were still pretty good, but we've unfortunately caught up. So the impacts of humans are reaching every corner of the oceans at this point. And in addition to sort of all those kind of extractive things, there's stuff like climate change, and this is a recent paper, and this is actually really important. They reviewed a whole bunch of studies, and they were able to detect that the warming has affected the oceans more than land. And so we're in a climate of warming, and of course we experience it sometimes here on land. And one of the reasons why the impacts are so much greater is that there aren't any refuges in the ocean. If you're sitting in warm water, you're in warm water. You can't, it's my son, darn it. You can't get to another place. And so that's important to realize, I mean, for all of you, that if any of you are dealing with climate change books, as to be thinking about oceans, we've got some really big stuff happening. And so that's why the coral outbreak story, I think, is so important. So one of the things I tried to do, no, I didn't try to do it, I did in this book, is talk a lot about my experiences. And I've gotten to do, I don't know how to say this without bragging about it, but some really, really amazing stuff. And probably one of the coolest things was when I was a graduate student, I got to live in this habitat underwater off the coast of St. Croix. The thing sits at 50 feet on the bottom, and we lived in it for a week underwater, and then marched out from it as scientists doing our research. And so I'll never be able to quickly pull up that, but if you look at that first chapter on coral reefs, I kind of opened the chapter by talking about what it was like to live underwater with this team of scientists, and sort of that was us with our twin 80s every day, these huge tanks. We would just kind of, you know, migrate out to the reef. There would be fresh tanks waiting for us at a tank stand. We'd put those on and then do our work. And, you know, for 8 hours of the day we were underwater working, and it was just a phenomenal experience. That was such a great privilege, and I got to do it 4 separate times. So I really didn't have a choice but to be a marine scientist after that. And those reefs were really beautiful. Of course, they're a little more impacted now, but still, this is a recent reef in Indonesia, and it's really beautiful. So we still have gorgeous reefs that we're able to work on, but they are endangered. And even the Washington Post, this is even 2 years ago, had a really big story, and I'm sure many of you have read some of these these stories. Does everybody know what coral bleaching is? There's a slide about it. So coral bleaching is when the coral turns white. That's why it's called bleaching. And it's technically the loss of symbiotic algae from heat stress. So these little green balls or algae that live in the tissues, these are why these are solar powered animals, because the corals derive most of their energy from the algae that live in their tissues. And so it's real superpower to be able to put together that symbiosis and make it work, but it's super temperature dependent, and even 1 or 2 degrees stresses these algae, which makes the coral get rid of them, and then they turn white. And then of course they're susceptible to disease. I mean, nobody can argue that's a stressed animal there. And so what's less well known is, and this is what it looks like, so you still have tissue on the surface of the coral, it's still alive, but its algae's gone. And so the big story here is that global warming is basically transforming coral reefs and endangering this entire, most biodiverse of all our reef ecosystems. And so this is just the 2016 data from, this is the coast of Australia. What you can see here is changing coral cover. So this is up to 60% loss of live coral in that event. And so when it's lost, it's dead and it's gone. The mystery though is what it is that kills corals in these kinds of events. And the work that my lab has done has been studying these kinds of diseases that the corals pick up often after those bleaching events. And so this is kind of, you know, they become susceptible to infections. And then the other part of this story, this is the Red List Index of Species Survival. I know this is getting a little grim, but hang in there. And what you can see is how species survival in these different groups has changed over time. And for a lot of groups, you don't see huge changes over time, even though we know, for example, the amphibians, there's been big impacts. But look at the corals. So we are in the middle of a real extinction crisis with coral species compared to anything else. And part of it is these outbreaks. So here's one that's going on right now in Florida and the Virgin Islands. So that's why that chapter and that part of my book I think is very important. I'm going to move across this. So how many of you have actually get to the beach and see sea stars on your coasts? Yeah. And some of you, did anybody have any experiences with seeing this as it was happening? A lot of people did. What you would see is you'd see a sea star, and then it would go into these contortions, and then literally their arms would come off, and then they would die. And so it's important because we care about these organisms. It's also important though because it's the largest marine outbreak in any kind of wildlife, whether it's a dolphin or a whale or anything. And it's so large because over 20 species were affected, and it was all the way from Mexico to Alaska. And of course, these species are important ecologically. And so this is what some of our sites used to look like, with just really high numbers of this beautiful intertidal star. And of course, the effects of this outbreak, as I talk about in the book, are not like the same for all the species. I wouldn't say it was luck. I think it was good planning. We did the initial work to figure out what the virus was, working with that species on the right. This is the sunflower star. This thing is this big. It has 26 arms, and it moves really fast. And it actually can catch a clam. You know, we would have them in tanks like this, and they would see us coming. They'd run over to the edge of the tank, and you could throw a clam and they would catch it, like a dog catches a ball. So these are really pretty impressive stars. Unfortunately, they're the one we worked on because they were the most susceptible, and that species used to be as common as a robin in our waters, and it's now imperiled. And so this is what happened during that outbreak. So this is all of them, you know, running around on their rocks north of Vancouver on October 9th, 2013. This is 20 days later. All of them have died. They've picked up this virus. They've died and fallen off the rocks, and these are just sort of piles of the spicules under the edge where they've all the little bodies have gone. And so what I talk about in this book is sort of our experience, because my group did a lot of the research, and I'm going to play a video for you that kind of summarizes the imperiled status of this one species. And even though it's just one species, I'm also going to tell you that it ends up being ecologically important, and it's causing chaos in your waters right out here now because it's gone. So I'll talk about that in a sec. I don't know how well we can hear this, but I can kind of narrate it. Oops. Come here.
There's an epidemic in the ocean.
Can you hear that?
Since 2013, a viral disease has been turning sea stars in the Northeast Pacific into melted piles of goo. Of the 20 or so species of sea stars affected by the virus, one of the hardest hit were sunflower stars. Until now, we haven't known just how bad the decline was, but new research has begun to reveal the longer-term continental scale impact of the epidemic on certain species. Scientists in the U.S. are now suggesting we formally list the once common sunflower star as an endangered species. Trained citizen science divers from California to Alaska counted sunflower stars on over 11,000 dives, while scientific divers from the Hakai Institute carried out more detailed surveys on the BC Central Coast. When they looked at all the data, scientists noticed something in common where they saw outbreaks of the virus: anomalously warm water. We still don't know how these warm water anomalies and the virus interact, but researchers say these warmer than normal water temperatures were related to dramatic sea star declines. While divers can patrol waters near the surface, we didn't know whether sunflower sea stars might have found refuge at deeper depths. But thousands of NOAA bottom trawl surveys have revealed that when it comes to sunflower stars, the disease didn't stay in the shallows. For example, data from Washington State shows a crash of populations in both shallow nearshore and deep offshore environments after the epidemic began in 2013. Data from other areas on the coast are similar, with population declines of as much as 80 to 100% in areas across the 3,000 kilometers from Alaska to California. Sea stars may appear to be the passive bottom dwellers of the deep blue, but they're actually pivotal predators in this ecosystem. The loss of sunflower stars is already showing massive repercussions on ocean food webs and kelp forest habitats up and down the coast. One thing is for sure, scientists and recreational divers alike will be checking to see when or if the sea stars recover.
So it was really nice that we worked with the Hakai Institute to actually produce that video. Does anybody have any questions about that as I keep going? Okay, it can be pretty informal here, right? It's not a huge group. So we're actually working with the Seattle Aquarium and the Nature Conservancy to list that species as an IUCN Red List endangered species, and it will be the first time something like a starfish has actually been listed. A lot of the corals are listed, a lot of sort of marine mammals, but it's a kind of a milestone in our keeping track of marine biodiversity. It's also a case where it matters a lot. So again, we've been fortunate to be able to rely on citizen science data. So these are teams of trained just folks that are going out as recreational divers, and they're counting stuff like sunflower stars and urchins. And so this database goes back to 2007. So we had over a 10-year database to use with lots of observations. You can see there used to be a fair number of these. There have been some declines. This is just California, so these are your waters. But when 2014 hit, they reached 0. There are 0 in the waters. Nobody can find them now, still. And what happened is the urchins exploded. So the sunflower star were the predator. predator that was holding these urchin populations in check. Now, urchins are good things, but not when they explode, because when they explode, does anybody know what they eat?
The kelp.
Right. So when the urchins explode, they totally level the kelp beds, and so that's what's happening, and that's why the Nature Conservancy is come to us for help, and they're supporting a captive breeding program for the starfish, out of a lot of concern for how to support recovery. Okay, I'm going to move to my last example, which are the California abalone, and I really like this example because it's one that most people don't know a lot about, even though they're really cool. First off, California once had a really beautiful biodiversity of gorgeous abalone, and now 3 of these are either listed on the endangered species list here or in Washington State. And a large reason that they're not able to recover is because of disease. So again, this is kind of continuing the theme of disease contributing to endangerment of important species. And once again, there's a temperature component. And so, for example, one of these, the pinto abalone, this cute little guy here, is actually the only one that's in Washington State waters. And it is, of all of these, it's the most vulnerable to the disease I'm about to tell you about. And so if our water's warm, we're gonna lose that in our waters because of that. So those are the ones that are endangered by overfishing and disease. And so the other reason I liked that example is it was a really perplexing mystery of what was killing the abalone. So it started off in 1986 with Brian Tissot, who was studying abalone. So he would do what we all do, right? Lay a transect line in the intertidal, count all the abalone, and there were so many it took him days and days to count them. And then all of a sudden, in 1988, he goes back and they're gone. So what's happening? Where did they go? And it took them quite a few years to figure out that that there was something serious that was actually killing these abalone. So it wasn't until 1990 that Dr. Carolyn Friedman, who's a pathologist and a really close friend and colleague of mine, got on the case. And so she took this photo on Santa Rosa. This is a sort of a healthy abalone, and this is one with this withering foot syndrome. And so they figured out the reason they were disappearing is because they were getting sick and losing their hold on a rock. And then it took another 10 years for Carolyn to figure out that it was this rickettsial bacteria that was actually killing them. And I like to tell the story of this just because it took a long time, and it was kind of a lot of false positives till they figured out what it was. But then the other reason I like the story, and that's what a rickettsial bacteria looks like. So it's these little, I mean, it was really obvious, right? If you did the histology, you could see it. And so it's kind of an interesting twist of why it took so long to figure it out. But then, the story goes on, and then in 2012, suddenly the black abalone are doing better again. And once again, they call in Carolyn Friedman, and they're like, what's going on? And so they look, they do more histology, and they find, in addition to those big spots from the rickettsia, that there's more spots that are a phage. It's a virus that's come in and is killing the bacterium and making the abalone healthy again. So it's like phage therapy in the wild. So it's a really cool story. So that's why I like that one. And so, you know, that story as well as others starts to give us clues about, well, what can we do to make things better? Or how do we cool the ocean hot zone? And so, again, this kind of, the ideas came from our experiences. So I spent many years doing research in Indonesia and running coral health workshops there. And we were running one of those, and everybody got sick, very sick. So, including typhoid, one of my colleagues had to be flown out because of that. And so we were working on this island, and we kind of said, okay, we're going to go back and figure out what's in the water. We figured out there was lots of raw sewage and pathogenic bacteria for both humans and corals in the water. We were funded by the Global Environmental Fund at the time to do a project on ecosystem services to try to figure out, for example, how seagrass beds could be helpful to coral reefs. So we thought maybe we can kind of put this project together to actually show how seagrass beds help not only coral health but also human health, to give us a little more leverage on the coral reefs. But really we got more than we bargained for, and we ended up with this really fantastic study that was published in Science, because initially we found these indicator, if I can get my thing here, these indicator bacteria called Enterococcus, and this is what they look like. So this cultured petri dish has all these little red spots. Those are bad. Those are all fecal coliform bacteria from human sewage. But this is what the plates look like outside the seagrass beds, and this is what they look like inside the seagrass beds. And we thought, oh, this is cool. Maybe the seagrass beds could be detoxifying the water and killing the bacteria. And so we planned this study, and sure enough, these were the levels of just that indicator bacterium at shore, here where the people were pooping on the beach. But it dropped off twice as fast when we did the measurements inside the next level at the seagrass bed than outside the seagrass bed, and stayed low out to the reef. And then the other thing, this was brilliant work by a postdoc who led this project. The coral diseases were also lower inside the seagrass beds. So it was pretty great that we were able to show that not only those indicator bacteria, but we sequenced all of the bacteria and found things like Staphylococcus, really nasty human pathogens in the water, and those were also reduced in the seagrass. So that's actually a project we're working on to this day now in Puget Sound, following up this notion that there are ecosystem services in nature that can detoxify and reduce the danger of sickness for both our marine organisms and for humans. So it's, you don't care about corals and starfish, at least obviously we care about people. And so that's kind of how I came up with this answer of how do we cool the ocean hot zone. Obviously dialing back warming would be a really very good idea, but we know the problems we're having right now in our country with that. But I really think this idea of more natural ecosystems that deactivate pathogens is very important, and so that's why it's a big focus of our work, and it's something I talk a lot about in the last chapter. And it's not just the seagrass beds, but we've also shown in marine protected areas corals are healthier. And so there's some real superpowers that are at the frontiers of science to be investigated. Also, less pollution would be good. For example, we've shown that plastics convey diseases to corals. The exciting thing is some very cool science that can be done, and I liked talking about that. And phage therapy was one of those, in part inspired by that Abalone example, right? Not only can nature come up with solutions, but we can learn from some of those. Yeah, well, the important thing is the will to save our oceans, and that's kind of what drives me in writing these books, is trying to show solutions. And so I like to turn to my other book, because at this point everybody's sitting there going, oh my God, what a disaster, what a mess. I'm really depressed. I don't know what we're gonna do. It'll never get better. It's terrible. And I feel that way sometimes, I really do. But this is sort of my happy place. And the story of this book is that the Blaschkas created over 800 of these glass models that are perfect replicas of species 160 years ago. And I'm the curator of this collection at Cornell, and what we've been doing is going back and looking to find the matches. And it might have turned out to be a sad story, right? It might have been we would go to look for something and it was extinct in the ocean, and we'd be like, check, 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 they're all gone. But no, we've gone back and really we're finding most of these. you know, there were a lot of common species, and some of them are rare, so I can make it a sad story, but actually I sort of feel pretty good about it, that we find so many of these beautiful things, and it just reminds me of the richness and all that we have in our oceans. And so I've loved that book, and I continue to like talking about that project. So this is one of our matches. So this is an anemone in Puget Sound in the San Juan Islands, and it's a little hard to know. Of course, you know which is the glass. And
No,
which
I was
is
just asking myself.
She knows. Which is the glass and which is the living invertebrate. And of course, Finn the dog knows because he's read the book. But, and I don't have time to show it today, but we also did make I did a lot of the diving to help make this film, but my colleague David O'Brown made this film, which really kind of runs a parallel story to the book A Sea of Glass. It's called Fragile Legacy, and it won a bunch of film festival awards, and it's a project we kind of continue with today. So I think that's the point at which I'm gonna stop and take any questions from you all. Yeah, Dory.
Well, the phage story makes me wonder, to what extent the ocean can, or nature can combat some of these problems. Where do you see potential there, and how long do you envision? Like, it didn't help the sea stars, right, yet. So what is your thinking on what you might discover?
Well, I mean, I think we do need science on our side because we have such large knowledge gaps in the ocean. You know, we know how to handle disease outbreaks in humans, right? We figure out what they are, where they came from, and then what to do about them. In the oceans, we can't vaccinate, we can't call, we can't quarantine, and it's really, really hard to just figure out what the causative agents are. And so, you know, we really do have big, almost insurmountable knowledge gaps at this point for handling situations like the sea star outbreak. But I think if we put more effort in, we're going to get a lot better at it. We're going to be able to manage some of these disease situations. We're going to find out things. I mean, it was only because the abalone were farm species, I think, that it got so much attention that the infectious agent was identified and followed enough that we figured out this phage thing. So there may be lots of other really cool things like that going on that we can use, that we can leverage to manage better our oceans. And you know, I mean, I don't sort of give up on the sea star situation. Right now, we don't really have any idea what we can do. But I gave a talk yesterday at Berkeley, and we had some really exciting discussions about this, including like, well, instead of, you know, beating ourselves up because we haven't identified what that causative agent is for sure yet, we should be excited about this because there's been a fair bit of science already put into that, and the fact that we haven't solved it means it's something new and different. And so there's a new exciting frontier here that we need to be tackling. So does that answer your question? Yeah. So you know, what can we do? Obviously, if we don't dial back warming, we're going to be in a whole lot of trouble. We're really going to be in trouble. I mean, we're already dealing with the second round of this, what's called the blob, the warm water that hit the North Pacific in 2015, hit again this fall. And I didn't talk about it, but we're studying one of our foundation ecosystems, eelgrasses. And it's a temperature-sensitive disease. And so, you know, we're just like, man, we're just going to have more than we can handle. But we all know that's kind of a tough problem. As much as we care about solving it, we're not on the front lines of being able to do a lot. Is there another question? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about why biodiversity is so important in maintaining the health of ecosystems?
Yeah. Can you tell me what your name is in case I ever end up talking to you?
Of course, my name is David.
David, nice to meet you. Yeah, well, I mean, the phage example is great, right? We didn't know that was in the ocean, so that was a sort of an unknown, undescribed component of our biodiversity that came to the rescue. So there's a lot of unknown examples like that. And then, of course, nobody expected that the sunflower star was as important as it turned out to be. Even though it's the largest, most obvious starfish in diving waters, you'd think we knew a lot about it. We did not know that. In fact, I was talking with folks yesterday about this. They're like, look at all this data, Drew, I've got on when sunflower stars eat. I can't understand how they can be, affecting the urchins that much. So, I mean, stuff like that, that's a component of our biodiversity that's turned out to be super valuable. It's affecting our fisheries because the loss of that star is causing the kelp beds to be completely decimated. And in urchin barrens, I mean, if this was an area that was like a rainforest of a kelp bed, an urchin barrens is when every single kelp is gone and there's just this pink pavement on the bottom. And it's not good habitat for anything. Does that answer the question? And of course, coral reefs are the most biodiverse marine ecosystem on our planet. They're vital for fisheries, they're vital for shore protection, for inshore communities. And they're disappearing. And so that's the economic losses are enormous from that. And there's no way back on that. I mean, this is when I get depressing, but I've done enough work on coral reefs that we're not going to be able to restore them. I mean, there are efforts to do restoration ecology, but the vital issue is to dial back warming, because without that, there's no point in putting them back. So it's really shocking to me.
My name's Amy. Nice to meet you. Who or where are some cutting edge efforts to dial back warming? Like things that, even if they're smaller, like are there any? Are there examples you can think of that are impacting?
Yeah. I mean, renewable energy is the big one, isn't it?
Right. I guess I mean project specific towards like, I guess I was thinking is like if there are governments or projects that you think are like leading the way.
Well, I mean, some of the European governments, again, are being much more effective at sort of electrifying their grids and dialing back greenhouse gases. And there certainly are some exciting, innovative approaches. I mean, our country is kind of a very worrisome part of it. The governance in our country is not on board, and so that's kind of the most disappointing thing of all. Of course, California has been a huge leader, and it's just wonderful to see how quickly change is happening and can happen, but it needs to happen on a global scale. Yeah.
Well, it also seems like the countries that are the most populous and the biggest polluters are not doing the most.
Right. No, I mean, it's kind of remarkable to me. We've been working on this since 1996, and so I just can't believe that here we are in 2019.
Hi, my name's Elena McInespy and I'm the Sales and Marketing Director. This is amazing. It's really informative. Some of the things you're like, oh, everyone knows. I'm like, I didn't know that. One of the things that I'm interested in, we recently had another author come in and she was talking about how the doom and gloom of global warming and climate change and all these things happening are really affecting her students and enrollments, and I've heard that from a few faculty. So I'm just wondering, do you find that happening too? Do you feel like that's something that your community is trying to tackle? Because I can hear it coming through from you every once in a while, but it seems like a theme that keeps coming up.
Well, I mean, I think you know, we're mindful that we need to come up, I mean, it's a little bit hard to come up with positive sort of solutions when, you know, there's this juggernaut that's really a little bit hard to deal with. I mean, our students, I don't think it's affecting our enrollment, at least I haven't seen that, I don't know. I am pleased to see that a lot of our students are becoming real activists in
You do
that
feel
sense.
like that, that's good.
And I do think there's a group called Ocean Optimism, and I do think that that's been very helpful, and I incorporate that actually into my teaching. And I think that is one of my students' favorite classes, is I send them to that website. I say, I want each of you to come in and bring me your best story about, you know, good things that are happening in the oceans in terms of management and, you know, things like marine protected areas or ways of dialing back plastics or, you know, solving some of these problems. And so they definitely become much more motivated when they see something they can do.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that is really important. And I mean, that's why I wanted to end that book on, you know, some of the solutions, local solutions from nature that we can be using. And in fact, that's why we're doing the work we're doing in Puget Sound, because I'd like to really activate that whole area to work hard on its ocean sustainability, because there are a lot of problems that can be solved. And does that answer your question?
It does. It's just, you know, so now I have 2 young children. I'm like, oh, I have to be wary and aware of, you know, they're already talking about climate change and protesting, and they're little, so I'm like, all right, I need to make sure that I'm doing this in a way, and that we're talking to the next generation in a way that doesn't burn them out and you know, have this sort of doom and gloom of the future.
Yeah. Well, there's definitely a lot of what's the word for it? Climate depression, or you know, I mean, it does definitely catches up with us.
Yeah.
It's hard to see the ecosystems you care so much about being in danger. Yeah. It's particularly really difficult in the coral reef community. You know, I think we're at the point where it's governance. It's governance and renewable energy. Yeah.
On a lighter note, if any of us were to find ourselves at Cornell, what can we view of the Blaschka glass specimens? Are like, how much of the collection is ever on view? Is it ever on view regularly? I mean, they're obviously so fragile. I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, no, they're those guys are on view. We have about 250 models that are on view actually in my buildings. We have a beautiful display of them. There's about another 30 or 40 on view at Cornell Museum of Glass. Cornell Museum did a whole exhibition of our collection, well, actually, just as that book was being released. And so, yeah, they're very easy to see. Yeah.
They're not specimens that can easily travel, I would imagine.
They don't travel
at all at this point. Yeah.
Well, every now and then I have 3 of them on. The only one I've ever allowed to that I've ever loaned them to is Monterey Bay Aquarium. So 3 of them are on exhibition as part of their tentacles exhibit. So 3 of the octopus relatives are on exhibition there.
Wow.
Yeah. And they've been a wonderful partner in the film that we've been doing. We did a bunch of filming there because they have some pretty cool stuff that you can't actually find in nature. Yeah. So, and that first book was really such a fun one to do, as you know, although hard to do because of all the pictures and all the names. But I think there's about 50 beautiful color plates in that book, and so it's a really cool book. So yeah.
Hi, I'm Steve. Thanks so much for sharing your work. I'm curious if you have another book project in mind. Is there a particular aspect of your research and your findings that you would like to delve into to that degree?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think probably many of you know the way it often works is sometimes topics for books find authors. It's not like we find them, they find us. And so I know there will be another book, but I don't know yet what it is. I'm kind of waiting patiently. There's still a lot of work. I mean, this is still the first year for Ocean Outbreak, and know, it's just a lot of work to support publication of a book like that, and there's yeah, just still a lot to do with that. So, you know, I don't know what the next one's going to be. Yeah, but I'll look forward to it when it comes my way. It'll have to do with the oceans. Yeah. Well, thank you all.
Thank you,
Thank
Drew.
for coming.
Pleasure.
Yeah.